Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Kidwell. I manage the tax-exempt practice for OneAmerica, and I'd like to talk about what we see as opportunities for advisors, touch on what plan sponsors are looking at right now. But before I get into that, I would ask you to plant this question in your head. And at the end of this, you're going to decide yes or no, this is something I'm interested in. So I'd like you to consider what you enjoy most about working in the retirement plan space, about what you do with sponsors, what you do with participants, and sort of figure out what you like to do. Think about what you like to do, what you don't like to do, and see if that fits with this market. And you know, my least favorite topic in school, whether it was high school, college, middle school, was history. So I'm going to start this with a little history lesson just to sort of set the table. In the tax-exempt space, we work with a lot of organizations that have been around for a long time. So they tend, many of them predate ERISA by many years. The 403B regulations, pardon me, 403B legislation actually came into place in 1958. So long before 401k came into play, 403B was already there. And many of these plans that you'll work with are both have 401A plans as well as 403B plans, occasionally 457 plans. And many, again, these plans have been around a long time, and we can't go in and turn them into 401ks, and there's many reasons not to, but that's the first thing that pops into many people's heads. But what happened, around 2000, the IRS started looking heavily at 403B plans so they could get their mind around them. And what they discovered was most were operating incorrectly. So they gave us some new regulations, proposed them in late 2004, 2005. They became final in 2009, effective 2010. And it took 403B from what I consider the wild west, where nobody was responsible, to a very employer-centric retirement plan. So whether it was ERISA or non-ERISA, the new rules required that the 403B plan essentially be controlled, operated by the employer, just like a 401k. So since these plans have been in place for sometimes 50 years, it took the employers a long time, and continues to take the employers some significant effort to get them what I would call modernized. So even today, many of these plan sponsors struggle to operate their plans correctly because they've got the baggage of 50 years worth of other things. So the way I describe it now is many of these plans have problems. I may not know they have problems, but they all could be improved, at least the ones we look at most on a day-to-day basis. Still today, the market is served primarily by a handful of direct providers, and that's where the opportunity for the advisor really comes into play. The size of the market, the demographics, it's $2.6 trillion in the tax-exempt space. We're going to talk, it's not just 403B, it's 401k, it's 401A, it's 457. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's $2.6 trillion, so it's roughly a third the size of the 401k market. What is different about it is that 46% of these plans still do not have an advisor. Even though there was a plan sponsor survey done a few years back that said 92% of plans would like to have an advisor, you still have 46 that do not have an advisor. The other thing that's different about this, I'm not sure how many 401k providers are left out there, but in this space, there's about 12 that we compete with on a day-to-day basis. And there's really about 6 of those 12 that operate consistently in the markets we work in. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what are we seeing? We're seeing a lot of advisors go after this market. We're seeing a lot of advisors get really frustrated with the market, and because it does take a while. We see the lawsuits in this market just like we do in the 401k space. We see TPA stepping into this market in a bigger way. We'll talk about that in a minute. We also see the continued consolidation in the marketplace. The last bullet point, we still see a shift away from DB plans, particularly in healthcare. We still see a significant number of DBs, but they tend to be in the process of being frozen or terminated. And in other nonprofits, fewer and fewer DBs literally on a day-to-day basis. First of all, let's talk about the types of plans. I keep saying 403B. It's really not 403B. It's 401K is 403B, 401A, governmental 457s, as well as top hat 457s. Where do we see 401Ks? We see 401Ks and clearly all over the place. The only place we do not see them, at least new ones, is in the governmental space. So if a government can have a 401K as long as it was established prior to 1986. We see 403Bs in 501c3 organizations, public schools, and churches. 401A, and typically there what we're talking about is a money purchase pension plan or a profit sharing plan. We see those truly all over the place. Some of those are very, very old and very, very large. Governmental 457s are self-explanatory. And top hat plans, we see those in about a third of our 501c3 organizations, but any 501c can have them. So it can be a chamber of commerce. There's like 28 subsections of 501c. 501c3 are the charitable organizations, but any 501c organization can utilize a top hat 457 plan for a select group of select group of highly compensated employees. And again, we'll go into detail there. Contribution potential. This is an incredibly important slide. In the 401k world, we live with the 415 limit of $57,000. So most for-profit organizations for the tax-favored retirement plan, defined contribution plan, we work with $57,000 limit between what the employer puts in, what the employees put in. In the nonprofit world, routinely we see multiple plans. So down market in the smaller employer size, roughly 40% have more than one plan. So typically you're looking at a total contribution limit of $76,500. Can be more than that. Once you get up to 1,000 employees or more, it's like 70% of the employers maintain more than one plan. And I'm just talking about defined contribution. I'm not referring to defined benefit for purposes of this discussion today. So once you start stacking plans, you'll have a 401A plan, a 403B plan, a 457 top hat plan. Now your contribution potential is $133,000. And yes, they do utilize them. You will see some larger public charities where they do bring in incredibly highly talented people to run these things. And occasionally you'll see them fully fund the plans for all employees at the max. Not many, but occasionally. So how does this work? This is a very confusing slide. I apologize for that, but here's the purpose of the slide. We live and die in the 401k world by our testing. So we put matching contributions in to drive non-highly compensated employees to defer more so that we can pass our ADP test. Same with the ACP test, the matching test. So the way I describe it is our industry, both from a education perspective, a systems perspective, certainly education perspective, we're hardwired for 401k. In the nonprofit world, once we get out of 401k and start talking about 403b, just a straight 401a plan, a 457 plan, the amount of testing that is required diminishes. So for example, in the 403b plan, we don't have an ADP test. So our highly compensated employees can put in $19,500 for 2020 without regard to what the non-highly compensated employees defer. So if we've got one highly compensated employee and 100 non-highly compensated employee, those non-highlies can put in literally zero across the board. The highly compensated employee could still put in their $19,500. That's huge for this reason. Many of these organizations, and I'll use Goodwill as an example, but they employ folks that barely make enough to get by, if they even make enough to get by, making contributions into a plan is not where they're going to prioritize their dollars. The management group can still make contributions to the plan without regard to the others. That doesn't mean the employer won't make a contribution on their behalf, but in terms of deferrals, we don't have to worry about that at passing that ADP test. So in a nutshell, the way the slide works is 401k has all the rules. A 403b, you take away a few rules, you have a 403b plan. Take away a few more rules, you have a 401a plan. Take away most of the rules, you have a governmental 457b. And a church plan, you really have very few rules at all. You have some contribution limits and compensation limits is the only thing you have to worry about there. What that converts into is incredible flexibility in terms of plan design. So one of the most common questions I would encourage you to ask an employer in this space is, do you need to put in more money for a select group of employees? So above and beyond, and we'll talk about how to get there in just a minute. Market sectors, again, I put this up there to get you to think beyond public schools and cities and counties. In the healthcare world, keep in mind that there's certainly hospitals, but surrounding the hospital, there are post-acute care. There's the facilities that patients go to once they leave the hospital. So it may be long-term skilled care, a skilled care facility. It may be a nursing home. It could be the community clinic. It could be a mental health facility, but there's tons and tons of healthcare beyond the hospital. In education, what we're talking about today is primarily private schools and small colleges and universities, private K through 12. Not talking about public schools at all. In governments, I would encourage you to think beyond the city and the county. Think about the utility districts, the airport authority, navigation districts, those type of subdivisions of the local government. What you want to focus on there is where they have local decision-making authority. So they may have the option of being in the state-sponsored plan, but they also have the option of not being in the state-sponsored plan. We're seeing a number of local entities decide they don't want to participate in the state plan any longer. They want to do their own thing. Those are good prospects as well. Social and community service, certainly the United Ways, the museums, but I'll also ask you to consider Head Start programs. They can also be called community action agencies. There are literally tens of thousands of social service and community service organizations out there that need your help. And then certainly last but not least, our religious organizations. That can include hospitals, certainly healthcare affiliated with churches, but it can be just a pure steeple church. It could be a religious a college, university affiliated with one of the denominations. Those are all really, really good prospects. So where do you add value as an advisor? 4 areas. Investments, clearly you own that. Plan design. What we're talking about there is, well, best example is we routinely run into employers who they may just have a straight 403b plan. Remember, 40% have multiple plans, but that means 60% only have one. So the common question is does your CEO or your management group, do they need to be allowed to put in more money? So the way that works is they can put in $19,500 into the 403b or 401k, assuming testing allows, but they could also put in another $19,500 into a 457 top hat plan. So the deferral is $39,000 instead of $19,500. Many occasions the discussion is over once that topic is brought up. They'll say nobody's ever mentioned that to us before. Administration and compliance. This is nuts and bolts. This is the question is, explain to me how your plan works. How do participants enroll? How do they get distributions? What's your day-to-day life like in terms of dealing with the plan? And the way that typically works is if there are 2 plans, the employer has 2 documents. The employees have 2 enrollment procedures, 2 distribution procedures. The employer has 2 remittance procedures. it's everything times two. There's cleaner ways to do plans. And ideally you would, even though there may be 2 or 3 plans, you consolidate that down to so that there's one process. So one enrollment, one remittance, one distribution process, and that converts into time savings for the employer. Sometimes it's hours, other times it may be weeks that you're saving the employer just in finding a platform to streamline the administration and compliance of the plan. Employee communication or education, we sort of take that for granted, but what we see there is on more than one occasion we've talked to employers who haven't seen anybody from their provider in 20 or more years. And I'm not talking about tiny plans, I'm talking about decent sized plans where they have just are somewhat taken for granted. So we were in Lamar, Colorado. For those of you that haven't been to Lamar, it's about as far away from the beauty and majesty of the mountains as you can get. It's in the southeastern side of Colorado. It looks more like western Texas. But we got a call. Coincidentally, we do the retirement plan for the hospital there. This was the city of Lamar. The advisor cold called them and asked just for a meeting. They agreed to the meeting. He showed up. We went with him. They had not seen their prior provider since 1991. To give full disclosure, this was 5 years ago, but anyway, 1991 was still a long time ago. Not a huge plan. It was like $8 million for the 401A plan, but there's also a 457 plan. And they just wanted somebody to help them deal with their employees and deal with their plan. And stories like that are not that unusual. Before I go to prospecting, let me go back to this slide and bear with me here. The reason this was important, I'll make it easier. The reason this slide is important is because often employers and employees underutilize what's available to them in the plan. And you as the advisor can help them be better at utilizing the plan. For example, in sections, the second column, the second bar, they could put in 76,500. Let's use the city of Lamar as an example. How do they get to 76,500 when the city government clearly is not going to put in that much money for them? There's two ways. 19,500 of that would be deferrals into a 457 plan. That would be typically be employee money only. The remainder of the other $57,000 is where it would be in a 401A plan that the employer would put in place and the employer would partially fund. So it's not unusual in a city or a county plan to see the employer put in 8% of pay. Well, 8% of pay is nowhere close to $57,000. However, because in the government world we don't have to worry about non-discrimination testing, the difference between that 8% and the 57,000 can the employee can make that additional contribution as an after-tax contribution, not a Roth, but an old-fashioned after-tax contribution. So that allows employees, whether it be somebody who's close to retirement and they're trying to catch up, make up for what they haven't saved before, working spouse that's just literally working for benefits. There are ways and there are people that will fully fund their plan, a government employee that will fully fund their plan at 76,500. The number of employers and employees we've talked to that had no idea they could possibly do that, I can't count on. I can't count that high. Most don't understand how the plan works. What has to happen? There has to be a provision in the plan document that allows for after tax. Most of these older plans do. Nobody utilizes it. But if they don't have the provision, it's a simple amendment to the plan to allow for that. And then it converts into an easy Roth conversion at retirement. You can't do it while they're working because it's not a 401k. But it's the little plan design features that where there's a real opportunity to add value. And to do that, you need to get obviously get a copy of their plan document, ask for everything they've got. But many of these plans are not on cost, but on making the plan better. Clearly, you've got to be cost competitive, but cost won't necessarily move them to action. Improving the plan will move them to action. Real quickly, prospecting. How do you prospect in this market? Most of this you've heard before, but I'll say it again. Existing clients, you'll be surprised at how many of your 401k clients, the business owners, are involved directly with a local charity, or their spouse is involved with a local charity. Start with your existing clients, whether they're wealth clients or retirement plan clients. Certainly accounting firms and law firms. In most cities of any size, you'll have accounting firms that specialize in nonprofits. So, for example, in Nashville, there's one small firm there that does the audit work on almost 200 nonprofit organizations. In Houston, there are CPA firms that literally specialize in homeowners associations. So in large cities, the specialization gets incredibly minute, and certainly ERISA attorneys. However, there's a different way. I refer to this as not a cold calling market, but as a referral market. And the advisors I know who have been incredibly successful in this space, whether it be in healthcare or mental hospitals or mental health, private education, they get into the network. And so there's this magic form out there called a 990. And a 990 is a tax return for a nonprofit organization. It doesn't apply to churches necessarily, does not apply to governments, but it does apply to certainly the 501c3 organizations. They file a 990 every year. And inside the 990, it tells you everything you possibly want to know about the organization. And there's several free sources to search 990. So Melissa Data is the one I typically go to. You search by zip code. It will give you every nonprofit in that zip code, and you just have to look through it, see ones you recognize. But it'll give you the financial data, and then there's a link to the 990 that will give you complete data, and we'll talk about that. There's also guidestar.org, and then Wikipedia. If you're just looking for example, the hospitals in North Dakota, you can do a Google search, you can go to Wikipedia, but it'll give you a list of hospitals in North Dakota, or mental health, or any other type of organization. The 990 itself, let's just go straight to what it shows. Well, pardon me. The 990 itself will tell you what the mission of the organization is. It will list the preparer, which is the CPA, typically the CPA firm that's preparing the 990. It will give you a list of the officers and board members. It will give you the officers' compensation, as well as any deferred compensation. It will tell you the list of their largest subcontractors, assuming they're making, I think it's $100,000 or more. It will tell you the contribution, number of employees, the contributions to their retirement plan, and other benefits. And last but not least, it gives you all the board members' names. So there's one local advisor that literally carries around 10 990s, the 10 he's focused on, the 10 organizations he's focused on, to his existing clients and centers of influence, to see who they know and if they can get an introduction to those people. So the job is to get into the network. And then it's amazing the number of people who are not on one board, but they're on 2 or 3 boards. So again, I'm back to it's a networking business. And the best long-term play where I've seen people successful is where they get into the network and just work the network day in and day out, not all their time, but make contacts. go to the conferences, get to know the people, and then you become essentially a member of of the network. And so it's not unheard of to see somebody who does 50 hospitals or 30 mental health care organizations that they've developed over the last 10 or 15 years, in addition to their other business. This is a number. By the way, there's a lot of stuff I clearly can't cover in detail. And the questions that you're sending in, we will address those after the fact. But we'll send you responses to those. But if you want to talk directly to somebody to go into detail about this, you can call this number. Our space in this market, we're big in healthcare, big in social services, church organizations. I want to take a minute on this slide and talk about that. There's one magic discussion you need to have in the church world, and that is around the minister's housing allowance. So we commissioned a survey a few years back, and there's about 30% of churches that weren't even aware you could do this. But ministers, when they're working, get a tax-free housing allowance. And if the retirement plan is set up properly, they can continue to take distributions from the retirement plan as a tax-free housing allowance. This is a huge benefit because if you think about it, the minister has been living literally their entire career, but a significant portion of their income tax-free. If they go into retirement and can't do that, it will put a significant it will strangle their retirement, for lack of a better way of saying it. So for that church organization, you want to talk to the minister who's in charge of the business of the church, and you want to have the discussion about the minister's housing allowance. And the question is, does your plan allow for your ministers to take tax-free distributions, tax-free housing allowance distributions in retirement? If not, there's an opening for a conversation there. The other thing in the church world that can be done is under 403B, we can allow for contributions to the plan post-retirement by the employer. So where do we see that utilized? By the way, it's up to 5 years post-retirement. So where do we see that utilized? We see that when they have a senior minister who has historically put people in the pews, hasn't done a very good job saving for retirement. It gives the church an opportunity to backload their retirement plan with employer contributions up to the full $57,000 a year for each of the 5 years post-retirement. With that, I'm going to wind this down. Thank you very, very much for your time. Again, my name is Kevin Kidwell with OneAmerica. Hopefully this was of value. If you have questions, please send them in and we will follow up.